Hello and welcome to Talking Geopolitics from Geopolitical Futures. I'm Christian Smith. Back in February, on our first Talking Geopolitics podcast, Head of Analysis Alison Federker drew our attention to the increasingly unstable situation in Cuba. It's now 5 months later, and last week, thousands of Cubans took to the streets in the largest protests seen in that country in decades. And when things happen in Cuba, the world sits up and takes note. To understand why, in our fireside chat this episode, George Friedman dives into the geopolitics of Cuba, its past, its present, and its intriguing future. Also later in the episode, Philip Orchard explains why the Chinese foreign minister's visit to the Middle East is popping up on his radar. But first, in last week's What's on Our Radar segment, Alison Federker explained why she was following not just the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, but its wider impact on Central Asian stability. This week, we take a further dive into the region, as Ekaterina Zolotova in Moscow guides us around the map to understand what each nation in the region wants. Ekaterina, last week I spoke to Alison, who suggested that we might be seeing a return to a similar sort of geopolitics of the 19th century great game between Great Britain and Russia. Afghanistan's geostrategic value, I suppose, is as relevant now as it was back then. Can you just explain for us, why is it so important? What draws in surrounding powers to Afghanistan?
Yeah, sure. Afghanistan is situated in one of the most important geopolitical areas. This area connects the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Indo-Pacific region. So the control over this area means a lot for different countries, and it brings opportunity in trade and some geopolitical value for this country. For example, Afghanistan could become a transport corridor in Central and South Asia. Also, Afghanistan is rich in resources. Among them are copper and iron ore deposits, and there are also resources in oil and gas. So it is not surprising that Afghanistan became the platform where the interests of many different countries intersect. Among these countries, we can call China, Pakistan, the European Union, the Central Asia, the United States, Russia, Turkey, and others. However, due to hostilities in these countries and a lot of foreign interference into internal affairs of this country, Afghanistan is very unstable. So there are the conditions for the power grab in Afghanistan right now. And after the withdrawal of the American troops from Afghanistan, Taliban movement, a movement that was originated in 1994, are becoming very active to establish the power in Afghanistan. The problem is that this case has some. The problem is that this case was a little bit complicated because compared with the previous years, when there is some threat coming from the participating countries, are not running to interfere. For example, right now, Taliban movement continued the operations, but other countries found their own reasons for this wait-and-see attitude. The neighbors, such as China, Russia, Iran as well, increased their diplomatic efforts.
Well, let's start diving into some of those surrounding countries a bit more, and in particular the immediately neighbouring countries, I suppose. We should start with the likes of Turkmenistan and Tajikistan. What's their view on the current situation? They're obviously quite concerned about destabilising, a destabilising neighbour.
Yes, you are very correct that we start with Central Asia because Central Asian countries fear that this conflict could split over the borders. And they have high concern about the increased activities by extremists. And now there are three countries in Central Asia that share the borders with Afghanistan. It is Uzbekistan, it is Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. But at the same time, these countries are very limited in their possibilities and they can't do much on their own. In particular, Tajikistan is mobilizing the army and is trying to strengthen its border post, but of course with financial help of Russia, as Moscow remains the regional military leader and views Central Asia as its sphere of influence. And if we talk about some updates, we can say that the Taliban took control over the largest territory. Now they gained control over 85% of the country's territory, and according to some reports, they control almost all border with Tajikistan, and in other words, almost all checkpoints connecting Afghanistan with the countries of Central Asia. Other countries are not very active as Tajikistan. For example, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are having talks and joining to different platforms to discuss this issue.
And I mean, what are they most afraid of, really? If the Taliban retakes the control of Afghanistan, what concerns them?
They're mostly concerned with the spread of different extremist activities and terrorism activity, because these areas are not very stable economically, and the Fergana Valley that is very sensitive, and it can become the hotbed for the spread of the terrorism in the country. And with this problem, of course, Russia becomes one country that worries about this issue, because after Central Asian countries, this threat can spread over the borders in all Central Asian countries and come to the borders of Russia.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're in Moscow, obviously, Katerina. What is the view there at the moment? Is it also a bit of a wait-and-see mentality, or moves starting to be made as things on the ground become clear?
It is mostly wait-and-see attitude. The Soviet Union took part in the Afghan war, and now Russia is seen as potential participant in the military conflict as well. But today, Kremlin is trying not to overestimate its own capabilities. And there are several reasons why Moscow is trying to avoid it. First, Afghanistan is not longer a buffer state for Russia, but it is exactly the state against which it is necessary to create a buffer zone. And Central Asia, it will be a very good zone. And Russia is concerned about what is happening in Afghanistan, because the most important fact is the security of Central Asian republics. And we see that Afghanistan poses the threat to the security of Central Asian republics, such as drugs flow across the borders to Russia, and strengthening of terrorism groups, and this instability can be exported to Russia. Russia prefers to become a platform for negotiations and the mediator in this process, because any military activity in that region and any military interference in this conflict may be not very welcomed with Russian citizens. We still remember the Afghan war, and there are elections that are coming in autumn, in September. So our president and the government are not going to make the false steps.
Now, Turkey, of course, has set itself a goal of becoming the leader of the Muslim world. President Erdogan is obviously therefore concerned about Afghanistan as a key piece in that puzzle. What's their current position on the situation?
Right now, Turkey is not expected to leave the region for sure. But at the same time, Turkey, in my opinion, cannot be considered as a serious threat and a serious player at this moment. Simply because, there is the lack of resources, including the military. And second, Turkey is involved in many other conflicts, for example, in Libya and in Nagorno-Karabakh issues. So there are many other areas of interest for Turkey. And as you said, Ankara positions itself as supporter of the peaceful solution for the Afghan conflict. And right now, Ankara is trying to become this political center of the Muslim world and views Afghanistan as the door that can open this way to Turkey. right now Turkey is interested mostly in Afghan market, especially in construction sector. And I think that Turkey will be really good at this because they have experience working in hard and war conditions in Libya.
Now, China, of course, is a hard country to ignore in the area. They seem to so far have been relatively quiet in this conflict. What's the thoughts from Beijing?
In my opinion, China is also not in a hurry to act. After all, now opportunities are opening up for China. However, the future role of China is not clear yet. And Beijing understands this. China maintains strategic relations with Pakistan, and Pakistan known as the country that is supporting Taliban, and at the same time it has strong ties with Iran. And what China really wants is economic and technical cooperation, and it is certain that China doesn't want to replace the United States in Afghanistan. It is known that during the last decade, China has increased its economic and investment assistance to Afghanistan. For example, they invested in the development of copper mines, and in the future, it will clearly rely on economic projects in order to increase its influence and power. But right now, all of these countries are cooperating within Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So all of them, they choose wait-and-see attitude, but at the same time, they still continue to cooperate and discuss this issue.
Now, of course, Ekaterina, Pakistan is obviously, as you said there, on the border and it has been heavily involved with the Taliban over the years. Are they as concerned as their opposite neighbours on the other side of Afghanistan?
Pakistan, as well as India, they also took a little bit wait-and-see attitude, in my opinion. We know that for several years, Pakistan has been accused of secretly training and arming the Taliban in Afghanistan. However, now with the Taliban offensive, Pakistan has stepped up its security measures along Afghanistan. But right now, Pakistan may worry because India may use all levers to prevent the overthrow of the Afghan government. At the same time, Delhi worries that Taliban may be supported by Pakistan and they may become stronger. So both countries might be very careful at this moment, and they prefer to wait and see what the other opponent, what, for example, India in case of Pakistan and Pakistan in case of India will do in this case.
Well, speaking of India, again, another growing power that obviously has an interest in its local region. How is this affecting their particular outlook?
So, in fact, the great concern of India is connected with Pakistan because they are definitely afraid that Pakistan may have the ally in this region, the strong ally. So this is why they are trying to be involved in this conflict. But again, this involvement is happening only at the level of diplomatic talks and mostly within the organization of Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
So, Ekaterina, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met last week. What exactly were they looking at in terms of Afghanistan? Where are they going from here?
Yes, you are correct. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization met last week and they made a joint statement about Afghanistan. But anyhow, all of this story is really curious. And the most curious thing that most of these countries that are in Shanghai Cooperation Organization do not care what kind of the government will be in Afghanistan. But now everyone is worried about the peace and stability of Afghanistan. Though Afghan authorities call on external partners like China, India, and Russia, the participants of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to help the defense and security forces to fight the terrorism. However, I don't think that any of these countries of Shanghai Cooperation Organization is ready to intervene in the military confrontation. All of these countries prefer to conduct the dialogue with different forces because there they have another problem. The Afghanistan problem can change their future relations. And here I'm talking exactly about the cooperation within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think it is worth to remind which countries are included there. It is China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan from Central Asia, Uzbekistan as well, India and Pakistan. So we have 4 players like China, Russia, India, Pakistan together. Plus, there are 2 more countries that have the status of observers. It's Afghanistan and it is Iran. So, in my opinion, Shanghai Cooperation Organization will become the platform which is used for the dialogue. Although in general the problem of Afghanistan, it will be the test of strength for this organization.
Ekaterina Zolotova, I think we could talk about this for a long time, of course, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today. Ekaterina Zolotova in Moscow.
Thank you.
Now, Philip Orchard has been keeping an eye on Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to the Middle East. Philip, he's been to Syria and made some significant announcements about the Belt and Road Initiative there. What's going on?
Yeah, a lot of his trip around the Middle East is just kind of perfunctory diplomacy. Not a whole lot to read into, but they made a big show in Syria of saying that they do not support regime change and that they fully back the Assad regime. That's not really unexpected. China doesn't like talk of regime change anywhere for obvious reasons. And at this point, there's it's an easy thing for them. That doesn't cost them a whole lot to say that. That said, so Syria has been looking to China saying like, they might be like a great way to help rebuild the country. And they might be able to give us. They might be able to play a role that the other interesting countries in the region, including Damascus's main backers in Moscow and Tehran, can't because of China's deep pockets. So the question is, okay, well, is China really going to wade into this country that's been such a headache for so many other outside powers? And it's worth looking at what China actually cares about there to try to gauge a sense of what they're actually going to do, if anything. And yeah, I think China's main interest in Syria is their concern about in any kind of failed state like that, especially one's hotbeds of Islamist terrorism. Their main concern is the return flow of Uyghur militants into Xinjiang, and in both in ISIS and in the Nusra Front, there were a number of Uyghur militants involved in those groups, and in these kind of cases, China will generally openly support anybody who they think is capable of actually restoring control and preventing a security vacuum from opening up. And it's pretty clear at this point that that's the Assad regime.
Wang's also going to Egypt and Algeria, or beg your pardon, has been. Is this a sign that we should take Chinese diplomatic missions and their intentions, see them as bigger than they have been in the past, or is this just really essentially a standard diplomatic tour?
Well, I think China does have a very muscular diplomatic capabilities because of the fact that they have such deep pockets, and because they can pair their diplomacy with their form of state capitalism. And these things always lead to deals for state-owned firms and everything. And so they are very good at putting money where their mouth is and finding ways to cultivate influence. Now, whether that matters to the bigger strategic picture, it kind of depends on the place. Egypt is certainly interesting just because, of course, it's a U.S. ally. It's got these historical tensions with Israel. It's currently locked in this very fun dispute with Ethiopia over the big dam that Ethiopia is building, threatening to cut off Egypt's water. So people are kind of watching and say, like, can China come in and sort of influence the situation or play some sort of honest broker role? And it does have between its deep pockets and the fact that, like, most Middle East countries don't have a lot of concern about China. For the oil and gas producing countries like Algeria, China is an enormous buyer of that stuff, and so they're generally welcome, and that does give China an ability to throw some weight around and serve as something as an honest broker. But I don't think China's going to go far beyond that. Now, they do have core strategic interests in the Red Sea because of their dependence on imported oil and gas, and that's why we've seen them expanding their naval footprint in Eritrea, for example. But beyond that, in the broader, like in the Mediterranean, I don't think that's really on their radar. And so I don't think that's his visits to Syria or to Algeria. I don't think that's really part of it. But if we start seeing them shovel money into these places that, beyond ways that would make sense commercially or on any kind of political issues, that would suggest that China is starting to think more broadly about its strategic ambitions. But I don't think that's the case at this point, because it's just got too many problems right on its doorstep to give in to the temptation that so many other countries, great powers, have in the past and get bogged down in places far from home.
Philip Orchard, thanks very much.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.
Last week, Cuba erupted into protests across 20 cities. For a nation so tightly controlled, this fact alone is notable. But Cuba is damned by its geography, often caught between the United States and its rivals, whether it's the British, the Soviets, or now, just maybe, the Chinese. And so internal Cuban politics rarely stays internal. So what is the significance of these protests? Where might they lead? And are they linked to what appears to be a growing instability in Latin America? To suggest some answers, and many more questions, George Friedman spoke to me in this episode's Fireside Chat. George, in many ways, I think to understand the plight of Cuba and the importance of its geopolitical place, we need to understand the significance of the Gulf of Mexico for the United States. Why is that?
The Gulf of Mexico is the single most important waterway for the United States. 4 of the 5 largest ports in the country are there. New Orleans, Houston, several other oil exporting ports. And if those ports were closed off, it would have profound effects on the American economy. And this has been the case for a long time. And Cuba is in a unique position in that it formed two straits, one to the north of Cuba, a narrow strait through the Florida Keys, another one by the Yucatan Peninsula, which means it's very easy to close off the Gulf of Mexico by naval force. And this is one of the reasons why the United States obsessed over it when the Spanish Empire held it, and fear of the British Empire taking hold of it. And we were afraid of it when the Germans were sniffing around, and certainly during the Cuban Missile Crisis and afterwards when Fidel Castro was in. And it remains a very sensitive point for the United States. I'll exaggerate a bit and say it's like you'd cut off the English Channel. It would mean a great deal to England. But that's exaggerated, but it still is extremely significant. And therefore, what happens in Cuba, particularly with the presence of foreign powers, frightens us.
Well, let's briefly look at what is going on in Cuba at the moment and all these protests that have sprung up around the country. they're amazing in the fact they've actually happened at all, considering how tightly the Cuban government controls this sort of thing. But what do you think this tells us about what's going on in Cuba and where Cuba is going?
Well, Cuba has always been an impoverished country. It was unequal, but had some wealth before Castro came in, but it was deeply unequal. Afterwards, it became much more egalitarian and much poorer. Living in Cuba is an extremely difficult and painful experience. The Cubans blamed this on the American embargo on Cuba. We don't trade with Cuba. But that, of course, is nonsense, because they can trade with Canada, with Mexico, with Europe, with China, with Russia. They're free to trade with the rest of the world. They have access to whatever they want. Their essential problem is, as a country, is that they have been caught within an ideology that has made development difficult. They blame the United States for it, and for internal reasons that's plausible, and even people outside believe it. But the real problem is the way in which Cuba has been managed for a very long time. And what we saw was an uprising against what is literally hunger in Cuba, and what is literally a lack of hope, and so on. What was interesting about the rising was it happened simultaneously in 20 cities. It was organized in some way, and Cuba is not a place where you can organize these things. But that gives us a sense that there is enough organized resistance growing against the post-Castro government that they can organize this. Immediately, the government cracked down. They then turned around and, said, yes, we'd made mistakes. They tried to be conciliatory. But the point is that Cuba is caught in time warp. And it is also very important to the United States. The United States can't ignore its geography. And so it's continually a point of contention.
And historically, I suppose, generally, but also particularly when Cuba is in trouble like it might be at the moment, they'd look to outside powers to help. They obviously had the Soviets throughout most of the Cold War, the Venezuelans following the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The Soviets were fascinated by Cuba because of its strategic position. The nuclear weapons they moved there was not intended to begin a nuclear war, but to protect Cuba against American attacks. And yes, the Americans were aware that given the geography of Cuba, with relatively small submarines and so on, small vessels, they could close that corridor, and we couldn't let that happen. The Russians were very smart. They understood that maintaining that threat protected the regime and also gave Russia an angle. Now, we are in a position where China and the United States are caught in a duel. The Chinese have not started a war, will not start a war, because they can lose a war. They don't want a war. They want their ports protected and their access to the sea guaranteed. Right now, they have no basis for negotiation. If they had resources in Cuba, they could negotiate. They could say, look, you leave our ports alone, we'll leave your ports alone, we have a deal. I have no basis for saying that the Chinese are in Cuba or were behind anything or involved in anything, but just logically speaking, the situation that we have militarily off the Cuban coast is a deadlock. The Cubans can't live with that deadlock. If they want to bring some sort of pain to the United States and open a negotiation, Cuba is the place to do it. But it has always been the place to do it. It was where the British threatened to come. It was where the Spaniards threatened Florida. This is the weak point of the United States.
Think logically, therefore, though, the US has obviously switched on to this fact. It's not news to to Joe Biden that Cuba is an important place for US geopolitics. Surely then any kind of increasing Chinese influence is going to be thwarted in whatever way it can be.
Well, that's the issue. The Chinese have developed the Cuban telecommunication system. They, in effect, own it, whatever that means in this context. They're present in Cuba. They're present in a lot of places. So that's not the issue. But if we were to see Chinese submarines showing up or other surface vessels or aircraft, we would have a problem. I think the basic position of the United States is we don't have a problem right now. We're not going to create a problem. We're not going to get involved in Cuba. We're not going to get involved in Latin America, even though there's great problems out there. We're going to try to stand off and wait. So when this uprising began, the Cuban government, of course, blamed the United States as if there wouldn't be a rising without the United States. But the Americans were very careful, not to be involved. But if it became more than just Cuba, but an international playing field, then that would be a different sort of crisis. Remember, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis took place.
I mean, let's jump ahead here. Far too many steps to be reasonable, but let's just say, considering the situation that's in Cuba at the moment, and the Cuban government needs a new patron, and they get to the point now where they're saying, well, look, you've got so many Cuban people who are upset, we'll have to open up more to China as one of the countries that is most willing to assist us. At what point do the Americans then start thinking about their response if Chinese submarines, if the Chinese say, okay, that's great, we can come in, but we'd like a submarine base there too, please?
Well, I suspect that the Cubans understand the consequences. We will go wild. I mean, it's simply so fundamentally important to us. We will go wild if they do this. You also have to remember that Cuba has not been with a patron for a while. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it lost its main patron. It picked up Venezuela as someone who's willing to sell it at way below cost oil and provide food and other things. But as the Maduro government in Venezuela weakened, it stopped being a supporter. So Cuba now is in the position it's in because it needs an outside patron. And its greatest patron was with those countries like Venezuela and the Soviet Union that had political and geopolitical interests in being there. Now, China does have a potential interest. It also runs serious risks. It really is not eager for a war with the United States, a confrontation, and there's not going to be one in the current configuration of forces. The Chinese could attack, but they could also lose, and they can't afford to take that risk. Coming into the Western Hemisphere is something China has never done. It's a huge step for them. And even though they're undoubtedly discussing it, there are two questions. One, can we really support a military force in Cuba? Second, do the Cubans really want to have that much American attention on them where the government might not survive because of the interaction between the U.S. and the Chinese? So it's a very complicated issue. It's not obvious for the Chinese to do this. But if they want a negotiation, and right now they don't have a negotiating card, that's the place to go. So there's some interest on our part in watching what the Chinese do.
And speaking of the Western Hemisphere and Venezuela as well, it's things seem to be happening at the moment in Central and South America. You've had the Haitian president has been assassinated. There was an attempt on the Colombian president's life. The region seems to be becoming increasingly unstable. What do you think is going on there, George?
We're not finding any common roots. I mean, the assassination of the Haitian president does not appear to be rooted in anything having to do with Cuba. The events taking place in Central America have been taking place in places like Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, for quite a while. That has some Cuban involvement, but is really homegrown. We're seeing in Colombia serious instability, and of course Venezuela is the mother of all instability. So we're seeing throughout the Caribbean basin, what we call it, unconnected but very similar in certain ways instability. And that's the backyard of the United States. That's where the United States has always been going back early in the 19th century, very concerned about making certain that the instability doesn't spread to the United States, and moreover, the foreign powers don't take advantage of it. But there is suddenly, surprisingly, and without clear understanding, a wave of instability in this region. And we assume that each of it is unique. But the simultaneity that's involved is either COVID, and we can't figure out why COVID would do this, or there's some other forces we don't understand. But we do know as a fact that an awful lot of instability has crept into the Caribbean basin, all the way to North and South America. And that at some point, the United States, which is desperately trying not to be drawn into this situation, may be drawn into a situation quite apart from what happens in Cuba.
George, I mean, before the pandemic, we like to say that the world was becoming increasingly unstable. The pandemic's obviously exaggerated or accelerated that. It hasn't helped, to put it that way. Is this potentially just something that we might start to see more of around the world in places where things weren't stable in the first place anyway? Other factors, just a combination of everything is going to make the world a less stable place.
Well, stability is what we all believe we used to have. Instability is what we have today. The world has never been a calm, pleasant place. It has always been churning. One of the things that COVID did, it froze everything in place for a while. You couldn't go out. The army couldn't go out. People didn't go out and do things. Well, it's over now, and we're now returning to normal. The normal condition of the globe is there are regions who are unstable. There's tension. There's even war. And this is the normal condition in which human beings live. COVID, I think, calmed things a little while, making it difficult to move. Returning back to normal, it's not causing the instability. The absence of COVID, or decline of COVID, if you will, is freeing up the world to behave normally.
George, as always, thanks very much, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
And thank you.
Now, if you'd like to read George's recent article on Cuba, China, and the US, which was written just before the recent protests, coincidentally, you can access that for free by clicking on the link in the bio to the podcast. So just go into the synopsis, click on the link there, and that'll take you to the article. But other than that, that is all we have time for on this episode of Talking Geopolitics. Thanks as ever for listening, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks' time. Take care.
You've been listening to Talking Geopolitics from the team at Geopolitical Futures. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to Talking Geopolitics wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to hear your comments and questions. Go to geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast to leave your feedback. That's geopoliticalfutures.com/podcast.